He was very close. Um, he had similar kind of mindset to Michael, which is seek and destroy. And so that was he was very close. At the end of the day, Michael's was greater to me. It's just me. It doesn't mean I'm right. Um, but I think it helps if you saw them both. It helps if you actually saw them both play at their best, and I saw both of them play at their best. So I think I have some standing to make a judgment on which one was better. But like I said, excuse me, Kobe was close. He approached the game very similarly to Michael. He trained the same way. Um, had similar types of games, not quite the same, but similar. Um, so yeah, I'm sure that it's possible that in the next 20 years we'll see somebody that kind of looks like Michael, kind of looks like Kobe a little bit, you know.
The Basketball 100 is a celebration of basketball by the way of the 100 greatest players to ever grace the court in the history of the NBA. This book was compiled from the Athletics basketball writers and analysts and was edited by award-winning reporters John Hollinger and our guest today, the Athletics' David Aldridge. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for coming out to the show. Really appreciate it. Before we hop into the book, we have a tradition on our show. We delve into the latest topics with the WNBA and the NBA, but we delve into basketball culture. Why is this sport different than others, and what makes the game of basketball so great? So take this question any way you want it. What is your first or favorite basketball memory?
Oh wow, that's a hard one. There's so many of them. When I was a kid, my dad took me to the Capitol Center in Maryland, where the then Washington Bullets played, um, on a Sunday afternoon to see the Bullets play the Knicks, right? And so you come into the arena, and the vibrancy of the colors of the jerseys, the Bullets white jerseys with red and blue trim, and the Knicks road blue jerseys with the orange trim, just was powerful, right? And the atmosphere, the kind of hum of the crowd as you walked in, you know, because you never been in a building that big before. It was something. It was magical, and so everything that's, I mean, again, there's hundreds of memories of pro games, college games, high school games, men's games, women's games that it's hard to pin down to one. so so I'll just stick with that first memory when I was, I don't know, 9 years old. Probably we went to a game, and it was amazing.
Getting into the book, what was the framework in developing this list? Can you kind of take our listeners and viewers through just compiling this list, the process, how you came up with just selecting just this elite, I guess, alumni of players? Because I'm sure that was a very this arduous task. So can you just kind of take us through what was your strategy? What was the criteria in terms of compiling this list?
Yeah, well, we started in 2021. The NBA had its 75th anniversary team, um, and put a list of 75 players together. We knew that was coming. We thought it would be good for us at the Athletic to put our own list out of our top 75 of all time. We basically did a spreadsheet with our entire NBA staff and editors, and people could put the names in any order they wanted, and we kind of took that list, that spreadsheet, and averaged it out basically to find our 1 through 75s. Um, there was some discussion about some guys who didn't get on the list, but not that much really. So it came together pretty quickly. And the only issue that we had was that there were some people whose careers were clearly on the ascent, but hadn't quite done enough yet. Guys like Luka and Doncic, or Luka and Jokic, um, that we kind of thought, well, they should be in there, but probably can't make them. We can't put them in just yet, right? So, although I do think Luka made it, I don't know if Jokic made the original 75 or not. He's in the book anyway. Um, so we came up with that 75. That series ran through the 2021 season. Um, at the end of that season, we have a book kind of division at the Athletic. They had done the baseball 100 with Joe Posnanski. They had done a football 100. So they came to us and said, well, can you add 25 names and make it a basketball 100? And we said, sure. And so John and I and Rob Peterson, our great editor, kind of, I would say, shepherded the final 25 for the most part, with some input from the staff, but it was more us, kind of going over the list, and most of the ads were easy. There were a few debates, disagreements, but again, not anything bad or lengthy. After a while, there were guys that John thought should be in the book. There were guys I thought should be in the book, and I think most of them got in. Um, so that process wasn't that hard at all. And so and then it was a matter of we didn't take anybody out of the original 75. They're all in the 100. It was just a matter of, well, we have to move some people around up and down because Jokic has to be in the book, right? And some other people have to be in the book. And so we did that. That took a little while, but at the end of the day, it wasn't that difficult really to come up with the 100.
That's awesome. David, I wanted to ask you, big picture, it seems like when you look at basketball compared to other sports, things like a list, like in this book, we're always talking about who's the GOAT, where do these positions rank, who are the greatest shooting guards of all time, etc. And it seems like in comparison to the other major sports, it's just brought up more frequently, rinse and repeat with basketball. Just wanted to get your thoughts on why exactly that is, if you agree that that is sort of unique to basketball and the narrative around basketball.
Yeah, to a certain degree. I think that there is frequent discussion. Individuals have such an outsized impact on basketball because there's only 5 people on the court at a time, right? There's not 11, there's not 9, there's 5. So it just makes it easier to kind of extrapolate. Well, if this person was this great, then they must be better than anybody else who ever did it. It's just easier, I think. Even though the game is wildly different than it was even 20 years ago, much less 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Whereas baseball fundamentally isn't all that different than it was 100 years ago. It's pretty much the same sport. And so it lends itself, I guess maybe it makes it more accessible than other sports whose greatest players seem kind of frozen in amber. Like nobody really, obviously there's very few people that are still alive that saw Babe Ruth play, right? But so
right. There's
been nothing in a contemporary sense to kind of bring Babe Ruth to the modern era. He's just kind of like where he is, and that's it. And he's, whereas, someone like Bill Russell, because I don't know if it's because of the, people, there's more of a oral history in the NBA. I think people tell tales more in the NBA, maybe. I don't know. But you can bring him to this era and say, well, how does he compare to Shaq? How does he compare to Tim Duncan? Or, how does he, and so I think it's more accessible maybe than other sports are in terms of those comparisons. And so that kind of leads it. But I think the biggest thing is that the impact of a player is so great that you can easily kind of say, well, if they were this great in this era, they would be this great in this era. And that kind of ignores some real fundamental differences in the game that make it really difficult to compare players across eras, but people like to do that anyway.
Yeah, great points. I'm also curious your thoughts on, with basketball, it seems like anytime there's an MVP candidacy being built or things like that, which, as you know, ties in heavily into where we rank their all-time greatness, it seems like there are sometimes, maybe in comparison to other sports, more sort of off-court narratives built around that as well. I mean, you look at one of the biggest things that ever happened, the decision, back when LeBron left Cleveland, of course, there was kind of, this narrative, maybe a willful angst against him for a season or so before he was kind of brought back into good graces. But anyway, I guess my question is, do you feel that off court, kind of away from the action, narratives are more impactful in basketball compared to other sports as well when we're looking at greatness?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I follow debates about Hall of Fame in baseball or MVP votes in baseball or football for that matter, because I don't follow those regularly. I know they happen. I would say that I'm not sure I would agree with that just because I know in baseball, for example, no one from the steroid era has gotten in.
Yeah.
Um, and chances are they're not going to get in anytime soon. So
Mm.
that certainly has kind of impacted what people think of players from that era. Um, with I think with the NBA, what I think what you're getting at is that maybe social media has become so important to the discussion in the NBA, and maybe more so than it is in baseball and football. That there can be kind of a narrative about a player that can be created very quickly and kind of amplified on social media that has its own momentum and maybe I mean I'm not going to say it doesn't or couldn't impact people's votes and decisions. I do think that for the most part, the vast majority of people that I know that vote on these things do so very seriously. They aren't moved by tweets or TikTok videos or anything like that. They really do kind of try to uh, soberly assess a person's um, talent and production over a season to determine whether they should be MVP or first team or second team or all defense or not make it. Now there are variables that people can disagree with, like winning, for example, is important to me. Maybe it's not important to another voter, but it's important to me because we do this every year for a reason. This isn't like, a charity basketball event. We want to find out who wins at the end of the day. That's why we do this. That's why you have a regular season and a playoffs to find out who the best team is. And so that to me is important, but it's not as important to other people. So, but I do think social in the NBA, because the NBA is more connected to its fans through social media, um, has a much bigger impact. And somebody can go on Twitter and say, these numbers support my favorite player's candidacy, and these numbers detract from my less favorite player's candidacy. And so it becomes almost a referendum on play style as opposed to what they're actually doing on the floor.
David, I want to go back to the list and get your observations with the top 100. What do you notice just through all these players? Just your observations, just through, and it's kind of, I think, goes through the history of the NBA. So, what are your observations in terms of play style, in terms of evolution of this player mentality, scoring, just the evolution of the game? What did you just observe through this compiling this list overall?
Well, Chris Webber has this great saying that championship teams aren't necessarily the most talented. They tend to be the most stubborn. They just they will not accept losing. They don't accept defeat. They continue to fight in the face of defeat. And I think that is applicable to all of the 100 players that are in this book. They all had obstacles of one kind or another. Some were talent based, some were injury based, some were race based, some were, all kinds of different things. They all kind of overcame all of those obstacles and became the greatest at their positions in their era. We made a conscious decision that we were not going to fall victim to recency bias, and we were not going to just have 95 of the top 100 players be guys who played after 1990. That would be absurd, right? Um, we wanted to make sure we honored every era of basketball. You don't have an NBA without George Mikan, right? It doesn't exist. He saved the league. You have to acknowledge that, right? You have to um, give him his flowers for his role in keeping the league alive in its infancy. Russell and Chamberlain for similar reasons. There and we wanted to make sure, like Bob Pettit is a great player. Like he should be in this book. Like you shouldn't forget Bob Pettit because he stopped playing 50 years ago. Like he was still a great player. So we wanted to honor all of the NBA's runway. And that was an important part of it. Because to your point, the skills, the stubbornness of those players is just as impressive as the stubbornness of Jason Tatum and today. Like same thing. Hadn't won yet. Can't win with him. Can't, doesn't make his teammates better. All this same stuff they said about Jordan. Same stuff they said about Wilt Chamberlain. Same stuff. You know what I mean? There's a flow line, a through line through this. And the greatest players just keep coming. They don't stop. They keep attacking. And that's hard to do. It's hard to do because you get older. It's hard to do because you get injured. It's hard to do because you get paid a lot of money. And once you get paid a lot of money, that incentive can go away for a lot of people. And it doesn't go away for the greatest. Nobody cares how much money Kobe Bryant made in his career. You know what I mean? Nobody cares because he brought it every night. He was there on the court. And money never comes up. And you know how money never comes up when you're talking about the greatest players of all time? No, never, ever comes up. Because they transcend that with their stubbornness and their greatness and their will and their work ethic and all of those things. And luck plays a part in this too, for sure, as it does for all of us. But I've found that it's funny how lucky the greatest players of all time tend to be.
Point.
Can you go into that? Like, a quick timeout from the interview to request a favor. If you love our interviews, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video to hear more interviews from the world of basketball, featuring journalists from SB Nation, ESPN, CBS Sports, and The Athletic. Now, back to the interview. Through just your research, how many players do you think have been truly lucky, just the breaks that have gone their way, or do you think that's just a part of sports?
I think it's just a part of sports. I think that when I say luck, I don't literally mean they found the four-leaf clover somewhere.
Sure.
I mean that they had good fortune. A coach believed in them. A player who was in front of them got traded or got injured. They were able to overcome or get return from injury because modern medicine's better than it was 40 years ago. And they had, like when I started covering the league, if you tore your ACL, your career was pretty much over. Like you had there was a very small chance you were going to come back and be a good player again. Well, now ACL is, I'm not going to say it's no big deal, but people come back from it all the time. People come back from it. They play. They're just as good as they were before because training is better and operations are better. Surgical procedures are better. They don't cut as much. You don't have to wear a hip to ankle cast is what you had to wear back in the old days after an ACL surgery, and you had to wear it for 6 weeks, right? And that was standard procedure. Like every doctor would tell you that's what you should do. Well, nobody does that now, right? So that's luck. So somebody who gets hurt now doesn't have to worry about an ACL injury ending their career. That's luck. That has nothing to do with them. That has to do with things are better now than they were 40 years ago, and it's easier to come back from injury.
Wanted to ask, David, your opinion. You wrote specifically the chapter on Wilt Chamberlain, and I feel like he's a character in NBA history that, Justin and I did not have the privilege of watching, but you get narratives that are very, very polarized, like ball hog or all the way to like the greatest that ever did it. Just wanted your thoughts on Wilt Chamberlain and sort of like a modern understanding of his career. Maybe what are some misconceptions that you think people have about Wilt Chamberlain?
Well, I think people get caught up in the numbers, and I understand that. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers because his numbers are different from everybody else's numbers who ever played the game.
Yeah.
From player one to whoever players 19 billion, whatever it is now. I don't know how many people played in the NBA, but his numbers are different. They just are different. They're bigger. They're just so much bigger and larger and just insanely huge. You have to start with that, right? But you can't get caught up in that. because just like you can say, well, he averaged 50 a game, he must be the greatest player of all time. You can also say, well, he only won 2 championships, so how great could he be, right?
Yeah.
There's some truth in both of those statements, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So you try to talk to people who saw him play to get some sense of his greatness, his inability to be guarded. We have Bob Pettit, who I mentioned before in the book, saying that when his team would play Philly, the pregame was literally, all right, Wilt's getting 50. Who do we need to stop? Because you're not stopping Wilt, right? So, and that was how every team began their discussions of Wilt, and because he just was so physically dominant and athletic. I think the athletic part maybe gets overlooked. They just think he was big. It wasn't that he was big. There were other 7-footers in the NBA when he played. He was big and a ridiculous athlete. He held track and field records in what was then the Big 8, which is now the Big 12, for years after he went to Kansas, right? Like he held high jump records for years. And so he had incredible athletic ability that just made him impossible to guard. And so I try to respect that level because it's so unique and so rare. You want to give it its props. You can look, a lot of people, I wrote about it for the 75 and we updated it for the book, and a lot of people said, he's the greatest ever. Like, why are we even having this discussion? And there's a case. He's got a case, but yeah, I mean, Wilt can very easily fall into caricature, and we wanted to make sure we wrote about the guy, the actual person, right? And so that was important.
I want to focus on Michael Jordan and an interview that you did recently with Rich Eisen. And correct me if I'm wrong, you said that Michael Jordan had the greatest will of anybody you've ever seen.
Correct.
And I just want to ask, in this era of sports now, is it possible for an athlete to have a similar will to Jordan? What I mean by that is just the way the sports is in terms of NIL, the money that they make, just the savviness of your athlete that might happen earlier in high school, social media. Is that possible for an athlete just to have that same will to win, or is that just human nature that we'll see somebody with just that someday? It might be 50 years, 100 years from now, but it will happen just in terms of how the life cycle of sports works.
I mean, I'm sure that there's some child out there. Maybe he's 3 right now. Or maybe 20 years from now, there'll be a child born that has a similar will. So yeah, it could happen. Sure. I mean, Kobe was close in terms of will. He was very close. He had similar kind of mindset to Michael, which is seek and destroy. And so he was very close. But at the end of the day, Michael's was greater to me. It's just me. It doesn't mean I'm right. But I think it helps if you saw them both. It helps if you actually saw them both play at their best. And I saw both of them play at their best. So I think I have some standing to make a judgment on which one was better. But like I said, excuse me, Kobe was close. He approached the game very similarly to Michael. He trained the same way. Had similar types of games, not quite the same, but similar. So yeah, I'm sure that it's possible that in the next 20 years, we'll see somebody that kind of looks like Michael, kind of looks like Kobe a little bit. The problem is when you anoint people after one good playoff series and say, well, they're just as good as Michael Jordan, like they did with poor Anthony Edwards after last year. And I keep going, whoa, wait a minute. Like, how did he get to Michael Jordan level? Because he had one good playoff series. What? You know what I mean? Like,
pump the brakes.
So, yeah, people want so badly to find their Michael Jordan so that they can say they saw the greatest player of all time. And you just have to go, guys, come on. Come on. He never played a 7th game in a finals. That's the bottom line. He never played. He never needed 7 games, and he won 6 championships. Everybody else had to play a 7th game to win a championship, and his team never did. So that's where I start with Michael Jordan.
Yeah, it's incredible. And you look at like LeBron being, counting stats wise, the all-time leading scorer in the NBA, and it came out on Inside the NBA. I'm sure you saw that, like he had yet at that point in time to catch Michael Jordan in 30-point games. In spite of like LeBron's great. I mean, there's certainly an imprint there that Michael Jordan left. Speaking of which, one of the things we have narrative wise, when you look at like Jordan and Kobe, we have all these nice interview clips and narratives since the time that they retired that we don't yet have for LeBron James. I mean, any of the comments made about him have been while he's been playing. So I do wonder if LeBron's, like, kind of how LeBron's lore will be impacted once we have those like post-career perspectives and interview clips of him, all the kind of stories that you get with these greats.
Well, I mean, I'm sure there will be lots of it because he's played so long and he's played with so many different teammates, right? He's got that kind of, he's got a bigger universe of teammates that can talk about him. And so that will keep him in the public eye probably maybe longer than many. Certainly players back in the old days that only played for 1 or 2 teams, right? So yeah, and to your point, I mean, people have seen the totality of LeBron's career has been in the social media age, so it just exponentially impacts the impact he had, and will continue to have, because there's just so many tweets and there's so many memes and there's so many, there's so many of them that will go on long after he's retired. So, and then there's just the body of work. I mean, he like Wilt Chamberlain, LeBron's got a case now for number 1. He's got a case. Like, it's a real case. It's not a blown up, kind of mythic and untrue thing. Like, he's got a legit case for being the best ever. Because I'll say this about LeBron, there's very few guys that came into the league with more hype than LeBron did. And he's basically lived up to it. Like, that is hard to do. It's really hard to do. Like, he's never taken a step back. Now, he's lost some playoff series, but you could never, I mean, it's hard to say over a 20-year period that the same guy almost, I won't say every year of those 20, but pretty much, most of the years in those 20 is in the top 5. In the league. Like, you would say, who are the 5 best players in the league? It's always, well, LeBron, of course. LeBron, right? So, to be able to do that for as long as he's done it is amazing. And he gets all the credit for that, because he really he was I wouldn't say the first, I wouldn't say the first, but he certainly was the biggest player to come into a sport that had the hype that he had coming in. As much as, I mean, Caitlin Clark's big now. She wasn't that big when she went to Iowa. Like, nobody knew, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, there's very few people that know, Caitlin Clark. Nobody knew. Now it's bigger coming into the league. She's big, but it was so big, and he's been as good as advertised. Like, they say he's going to chase the game. Yeah, he did. Like, he really did. He's been that good.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine, if LeBron wasn't able to come in from high school and played, I don't know, a year at Ohio State or whatever the case may have been, that would have been kind of amazing. Right. And I think back to what you were saying about luck and how that might have changed a lot of things for, I think, a lot of the perceptions that are out there about LeBron. I mean, with all the opportunities he got to play in the finals, if the dice had just rolled a little bit differently in certain cases, there could have been a major swing in the narrative around his career.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, if he has 6 championships instead of 4, we're probably having a different conversation, right? So,
right.
But I would say, like, I'm just trying to think back, while we're having this discussion, like, so that means he lost 5, and I can't think of any of the 5 that wow, like they really got jobbed. He should have won that one. Like, no, his team wasn't good enough, right? Like he was great, but his team wasn't good enough, right? Like the three, like if Golden State doesn't bring in Durant, maybe those last two are different, right? But they did bring in Durant, so your team wasn't good enough, right? And that's what happened with those three against Golden State, and then Miami when he was in Miami, the San Antonio team in 2014 was the single most mentally tough team I've ever seen. In coming off the deck, coming back from losing in the finals the year before to the same team, and were just locked in from day one. And then, when they lost to San Antonio in '07, I mean, literally, I, I defy you to name the other four starters on that team with him in 2007. Like it was him against the Spurs in 2007. It wasn't the Cavaliers. It was LeBron against the Spurs. So the five he lost on merit. Like it's not like they got jobbed. So it's probably where he should be about in terms of championships. Like you could maybe say maybe he could have won one more, but other than that, he's kind of where he probably should be.
So I want to just shift the conversation to the NBA now. A lot of discussion about lack of interest in the league, low ratings, and what I observe is the NBA just signed a new media rights deal for a ton of money. Right. Tons of international players are in the league. It seems like the game is more popular than ever internationally, and this is kind of the natural evolution of not having a mainstream star. That happens in sports, and that's kind of what happens. And I'm sure, like you mentioned, like we talked about with the will conversation, there'll be a player that has a similar will to Michael. That will happen. The same thing. There'll be a star that will capture the casual fan. So why is this conversation kind of dominating this season in terms of just the narrative of the NBA? Because I just think it's kind of, I don't know, this is average of the course here. I don't think anything's alarming about the health of the NBA, or am I wrong? Is there something that we should be paying attention more?
I think there are things that you should be paying attention to. I think it's important, especially in the NBA, because the NBA is different from the other leagues. There are people who are invested in the NBA failing. And the reason they're invested in the NBA failing is because it's a league that's predominantly black with predominantly black superstars. And so there are people that want the league to fail because of that reason. And so you have to always have that in the back of your mind when you assess the problems that the league is having, because sometimes the actual problems that the league is having, and there are some, get blown way out of proportion by people who want the league to fail and are looking for a reason to the league to fail. So you have to take that and put it to the side. There are real issues, I think, with play style. I do think that we have to have an honest conversation, just like 30 years ago, the NBA had to have an honest conversation about the physicality that was being allowed in the game, and the amount of I don't even want to call it defense, because you can play defense without knocking people to the ground. There was a physicality that was being allowed that not only made the scores drop and made the 81-79 game in the finals be kind of normal, which is insane if you think about it. It was not fun to watch. It wasn't fun to watch. People did not like watching guys wrestling with each other and nobody being able to do what they are great at, which is putting the ball in the basket. Like it got really hard to watch it because people weren't being allowed to do that. And so over the last 30 years, they put in a bunch of rules. They've changed the rules to make it easier for people to take the basketball and go to the basket and score. And so you had this huge, shift in the NBA in terms of offense, but then you add the advent of the 3-pointer and analytics, making it almost making the mid-range shot seem like a dumb shot to take, right? Like you literally like, well, why don't you just back up? It's worth another point, and kind of chastising people for taking a foul line jumper, and so it kind of went too far the other way, I think now. And I think that's where we're at right now, which is this over dependence on the 3-pointer as your primary means of scoring. and people don't like that. It's every team. Shaq said this, and Shaq's not always right, but on this I thought he had a point. If every team looks the same when you play, when you turn the TV on, then what's the fun of watching it? Like the fun of watching the NBA is you see teams that have different styles playing against each other. You have teams that are great with the fast break. You have teams that are great 3-point shooters. You have teams that play great defense. You could say you have those same things now, but everybody hunts threes. The Boston Celtics hunt threes. The Washington Wizards hunt threes. And if everybody plays the same way, then there's very little distinction in terms of, well, that guy's great. Well, how great can people be if everybody's taking 9 threes a game? You know what I mean? So you're you've warped the game into this version of the game, which is not aesthetically pleasing to people, just like too much holding and grabbing and shoving wasn't aesthetically pleasing. So they got to figure out, how do we get it back into balance? I just think the game's a little out of balance right now. So that's a real thing. But to your question about ratings, like ratings are I think they're ephemeral. I don't think that they mean anything anymore. Certainly not what they meant 20, 30 years ago when we all watched television. That's how you could decide if something was popular, because all of us watched television. We all watched the same 4 channels, and you could decide, okay, the majority of the country thinks that this thing is the most important thing because they were all watching it. Well, now nobody watches television. Nobody under 30 watches television to get their information. And so the idea of what a rating is when you're watching a game on your phone or your iPad, or you're getting TikTok or YouTube videos or highlights, it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything anymore. So until we come up with a new way to measure how people are actually consuming information, I think saying, well, the ratings are down 12%, so the NBA is in terrible shape. No, not really. Not really. That doesn't mean there aren't issues that they need to address, but writ large, again, as you mentioned, if the league was in such bad shape, how did they just get TV networks and Amazon to give them $77 billion? Like, these are smart people. They're not morons. So they wouldn't do it if they didn't think that product was worth them investing in.
So who's invested in the league failing? Like, can you kind of go into specifically who are the bad actors invested in making sure the NBA?
I think any random sampling of Twitter will tell you the people who are invested in the NBA failing. I mean, let's be honest. Like, there's people who don't like LeBron James because he didn't like the former president and the soon-to-be future president, and they don't like that, and so anything bad that happens, they will assign blame to LeBron James and to the NBA. Because the NBA has coaches like Steve Kerr and Greg Popovich who are very outspoken about social issues, and who are very progressive about those points of view. There are people who disagree with that and want them to not succeed as a result of it. And so that's pretty obvious. I don't think there's much secret to that. You just don't have that in the NFL or baseball. You don't have people saying, go woke, go broke. Like, you don't have these kind of pithy slogans that people say about the NBA, and the causes and the things that NBA players think are important, as opposed to what football players and baseball players think are important. You don't have this subsection of people who want the NFL to fail because its coaches tend to be more conservative politically. Like, they're not there. Like, they just aren't there. NBA, the NFL is more popular than ever, even though a lot of people disagree with its political stances on things. So those are the people. It's the same people that, are disagreeable about a great number of things that a lot of people would want to happen in this country.
Seems like, I mean, to root all the way for failure, I can't even picture what that looks like for the NBA. Yeah. It's so unthinkable because it is a well-established institution and a live sports product. I mean, perhaps, they wouldn't get as great a value in the next TV contract, I think would be the most that they could possibly fail. But as far as the league ceasing to exist or something like that, that's never going to happen.
Well, I doubt that that's going to happen either. I think that again, um, they, when the first reports came out almost 2 years ago that the league was looking to triple its media rights deal, there were so many people that, oh, that's ridiculous. They're never going to get that much. They'll be lucky to get 10% more, and they tripled it, just like they said they would. They tripled it. So at some point, you have to kind of accept that they know what they're doing. Nobody is arguing that the NFL isn't the most popular sport in the country. It is by a huge margin, and will always be the most popular sport in the country, because it has structurally some things in place that just make it easy for it to be the most popular sport in the country. But that doesn't mean the NBA or Major League Baseball are dying. They're not dying. They're still supported very strongly by people who have loved them for generations and will continue to love them and enjoy watching them for different reasons. And enjoy the sport for different reasons. And they'll be fine, and they will continue to be fine, and they will be consumed in a different way. And the people that consume them will expect them to be there in a different way. And so that is where I think the disconnect between ratings and reality is because my kids do not watch television. The only time they watch television is when my wife and I are watching a game, and they'll watch the game with us. But other than that, they spend their entire life on their phone and on their laptop or their iPad. That's it. And that's every kid that they know. And that's how they learn. That's how they communicate with each other. And we don't have a good way to kind of determine how many of them are watching something at a given time. Now, we probably will in the next 15, 20 years, but we don't have it now. And so that idea of, well, ratings are destiny is absurd. That doesn't mean it literally doesn't mean anything anymore, because there's so many fewer people that actually watch television that watched it 20 years ago.
No, completely true. David, thank you very much for spending the time. Truly appreciate it. Can you let our audience know where they can find you on social media? Any other projects you're working on?
Yeah, I am on all the socials. So same handle, David Aldridge DC. That's Blue Sky. That's Threads. It's Twitter still. And at The Athletic, theathletic.com. You can look me up and see all the stuff that I write about, whether it's the Nuggets or the Wizards or the Celtics, or, we got some projects that I'm working on that I can't really discuss it right now, but there's a couple of good ideas, some of which we may have discussed today. So we've got some things coming up in the pipeline that are going to be pretty cool. So, but The Athletic is where you can find my work. It's on the New York Times website. If you can't remember The Athletic, just go to New York Times. We're in the bundle. We're near, where Wirecutter is, and all the games and stuff. You can find us there.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David. Truly appreciate it.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you for having me. Enjoyed the discussion.
Thanks.